Hello there. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today for this panel discussion on social infrastructure as resilient infrastructure. It's fantastic to see so many people attend from across the world to discuss this crucial topic as part of this year's C20 summit, of which I'm really privileged to have been asked to moderate. So thank you so much to the C20 organisers for inviting me to kind of take up this opportunity and talk to all of our amazing panelists today. My name is Katie Cresswell-Maynard. I'm the Chief Executive of Engineers Without Borders UK and a Director of Engineers Without Borders International. Just briefly about our organisations. So we're a global movement of organisations that exist to ensure engineering benefits all people and the planet through influencing the engineering community and directly engaging in engineering education and engineering practice. So it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to moderate this panel discussion on the value of bringing a societal lens to infrastructure. So before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping notices to share with you. So as we're online, I don't have to do any of the normal things that we'd be doing in a physical space, such as telling you where the toilets are or the fire exits. Whether you can smoke, eat or drink in your venue, that is entirely up to you. So I hope that you're in a safe environment to listen into our discussion today, where you can comfortably enjoy the next 90 minutes with us. And of course, we'd really love to hear from you throughout this discussion. So yes, we've got some questions that we're going to challenge and the panelists with and pose to them. But really, we want to hear from you. So after the initial introductions, we'll be asking the panelists some questions about our discussion topic, but you can get involved as well. And I believe you can do this by posting your questions in a chat box. That should hopefully be fairly obvious to you where it is. And our technical moderator will be sharing those with me, and then I'll be sharing them with our panelists throughout the session. And if your question is for a particular panelist, if you wouldn't mind just jotting their name on the question as well, so I know who to direct it to, that would be incredibly helpful. So that's enough of the administration. Now we move on to the more interesting stuff. So we're here today to discuss social infrastructure, and specifically social infrastructure as resilient infrastructure. We'll define what social infrastructure is shortly to ensure that we all have a shared understanding of what that is. But firstly, I'd really like the panelists to introduce themselves. So firstly, can all the panelists give us a bit of a wave? Just, we're a friendly bunch, hopefully. Yeah, great. Nice to see you all. I'm going to ask each of you in turn, but if you can just give a brief introduction to yourself, the organisation that you represent, and ideally a brief statement, try to keep you to no more than 3 minutes here, a brief statement on how you think social infrastructure is key to building resilience. So Cecilia, it'd be great to start with you.
Oh, thank you very much, Katie, and thank you so much to the C20 organisers for this session. And I'm bringing greetings from my Executive Director, Maimouna Sharifa, who unfortunately couldn't join, so I'm representing her in this session. And I'm really happy to actually join you because we're celebrating Urban October at the moment. And the theme is about valuing cities and communities. And on World Habitat Day, which took place on Monday this week, the UN Habitat Scroll of Honor Awards actually recognized 3 civil society organizations and the work that they're doing in different areas with urbanization. So that was one of the highlights. As UN Habitat, we work with partners to build inclusive, safe and resilient cities and communities with the vision of a better quality of life for all in an urbanizing world. And I'm Cecilia Anderson. I'm an urban and regional planner as a background, and I'm managing the Global Public Space Program within UN Habitat. And the Public Space Program actually falls under the Planning, Finance and Economy section. And it's very targeted there because when we're talking about public space, then it's important to look at it from a planning perspective, but also from the finance and economy side as well. So as a program, we work very closely with civil society organizations, academia, professional associations, but also local and national governments, and also public space enthusiasts. There's a network of that as well. in developing policy, building capacity, building partnerships, supporting cities in developing citywide public space strategies, and implementing projects on the ground. More specifically, as the UN, we're also actually monitoring the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular the goal number 11.7, which focuses on improving safety, accessibility, and inclusion to green and public spaces for all. So why is social infrastructure key in building social resilience? And I think it actually comes from many different perspectives. We're actually looking at it from an environmental perspective, but also from a social and an economic perspective. And public space as social infrastructure provides a really important room for people to come together on a social level, but also from a cultural perspective. It fosters that sense of belonging and pride in the neighborhood and brings communities together. And for us at the Public Space Program, these are really the valuable meeting spaces that are created for people. And they are the spaces where people can meet from all walks of life, and they can meet on an equal basis. And I think this is really important. So it doesn't matter what religion you have, what social standing you have in society, what gender or age, but everybody can meet at the same level in this space. And that's why it's so important. And I think now recently with the COVID-19 pandemic, I think public space and social infrastructure has really shown how important they are from a resilience perspective, you know, from actually improving air quality to improving health and well-being of our citizens. So thank you very much, Katie.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for that fantastic introduction. So now I'd like to invite Henry Blas to give an introduction to himself. Henry.
Yeah, hi everyone. So my name is Henry Blas. I'm the Chief Content Officer of the Global Infrastructure Hub, located in Singapore. So the GIA Hub is the dedicated infrastructure entity of the G20. It was established back in 2014, and our mission is really to support the G20 agenda on sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure. So what we're going to discuss today. And I guess our focus is really looking at the evidence and sharing best practice, especially when it comes to finance. So when we look at the sort of G20 infrastructure priorities, there's around three key ones. The first one is what we call infrastructure as an asset class. That's really sort of trying to sort of crowd in more private sector participation into infrastructure. The second one is because we don't want to just invest in infrastructure for the sake of investing in infrastructure. We want to invest in quality infrastructure investment. So that's kind of the second priority. And the third one is around leveraging technology. And that was this year by the Saudi presidency, that was the priority that was identified. So those are kind of like the traditional, the pre-COVID priorities. So I guess if we look at how those priorities have changed with COVID, I mean, most of the priority is still there, but what's been interesting to see is that there's a lot of push from people, and as a result, government sort of feeding it to basically enable a resilient and transformative recovery. There's really political pressure to basically support community resilience, and I guess that's where social infrastructure has proven to be so important during this crisis. The second one, which is kind of a little bit new and fortunate, is the local job recovery, which was obviously always there, but I think now it's at front and center. And that's something that we have to keep in mind every time we talk about priorities. That one is right up there. The third one is unfortunately also fiscal challenges. We started with a very wide infrastructure funding gap before COVID. And now with all the budget being diverted to emergency responses, there's now a renewed focus on private capital. Is there a way to basically leverage that private capital to address those challenges and invest more in a more resilient social infrastructure? So the reality is that from a government perspective, yes, infrastructure is likely to be an important part of the recovery packages. And analysis that we have done on thousands of previous studies and evidence has basically shown that, yes, infrastructure is really good compared to all type of other investments to basically create fiscal return and so get the right type of economic benefit. So I think we're very likely to see a lot of infrastructure in those sort of recovery packages, which may be good news for resilience and social infrastructure, because I think, again, everyone has seen the value of them. Now the question is, we all want sort of better infrastructure, but is there a way, or can we actually unlock additional investment from the private sector? And how do we actually achieve that? And when you look at private investment infrastructure, it's really a tale of two stories. The first one is that, yes, private investment infrastructure has definitely increased over the past decade. But when we actually look at the new transaction, what we call primary market transactions, which is excluding those transactions where private sector essentially exchange assets, actually those want to decrease. So that's a challenge, and that's not obviously the greatest news. What's not great as well, that social sector, the social infrastructure sector, is actually the one that's decreased the most. So there's a real challenge here to basically create the right type of project so that we can actually get the private sector to basically participate and help deliver that. The good news, on the other hand, is that multilaterals, the G20 governments and private sector are actually coming up and have come up with sort of new ideas to crowd in sort of multiple small projects, which is one of the key issues for social infrastructure, and plenty of other new initiative and new innovation. I guess it's a bit of a call for action on our end. Our role is really to sort of aggregate those best practices and sort of share that knowledge. And so we've gathered a lot of experience and sort of interesting ideas on how we could do this. But I think we're very keen to basically hear for other people, where there's some new innovation that would deserve to be sort of shared with the world. And the second point is on the privatization framework, which again is linked to those packages, those recovery packages that the government is gonna create. Is how do we help? What are the best frameworks out there to help the governments really sort of prioritize the type of investments that will actually be truly transformative and resilient? And thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Thanks, Henry. I'm already scribbling lots more questions to ask later on. So thank you for that. I'd like to ask Donna if you could give an introduction to yourself as well now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this exciting panel. I am Donna Lagdameo, and I'm calling from Manila. I am from the International Federation of Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies, the largest humanitarian organization in the world. And we've been doing a lot of work in the area of social infrastructure for the past 100 years. Excuse me. So on the question, how social infrastructure is key to building resilience, for us, the key is if it's done with and for the communities. As the organization that is mostly on the ground, we have a global network of local Red Cross and Red Crescent organizations, volunteers, chapters, national societies, and a federation. And bringing all of this together, we all work towards contributing to the well-being and aspiration of people experiencing vulnerability and marginalization. So for us, social infrastructure, it's not just about physical spaces, but physical spaces that contribute to a quality of life. Quality of life for the Red Cross is something that helps them have a sane decision-making, gives the community livelihood options, strengthens their capacities, and have better access. So it is not just about having the spaces where they come together, but it's intentionally built to reduce risks and build their resilience. So for us, social infrastructure is key to resilience building, especially if it's done in a systemic manner. You see, in communities, as we've seen in COVID, nothing is isolated anymore. So whatever decisions and approaches we have for schools, parks, libraries, what have you, they need to come together and be risk-centered at reducing risks. And interventions in one area contribute to the other, or reinforce, or contradict. So we need to plan social infrastructure investments by having a clear focus that these will all help reduce risks and builds resilience of communities on the ground. And I would like to also touch on a point that was made earlier. For us, social infrastructure is key if it is achieving transformational changes. We need to repurpose our view in terms of social infrastructure as seeing them just as physical structures or areas where people meet. We need to use them as vehicles to have that transformational and lasting change, and allows communities to actually adapt, anticipate, and respond to risks in timely manner across different timescales. So in the Red Cross, Red Crescent family, we are instituting a lot of changes. 100 years ago, you've known Red Cross as simply just a humanitarian organization or response organization. But actually, we've been on the ground before, during, and after disasters. And we work with communities, and we want to make sure that all the interventions or activities are aimed towards really helping them reduce vulnerabilities, including through social infrastructure. Thanks.
Thank you, Donna. Thanks very much. Francine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Katie, and thank you to the C20 organizers for inviting me to be part of this important conversation, and good morning to all. I'm actually a lawyer by profession, and I have also served as a Minister of Government and now as interim CEO of Dominica's Climate Resilience Execution Agency, CREED. CREED was actually formed by the government as an agency to lead our recovery process after we were devastated by a Category 5 hurricane in 2017, and to develop a climate resilience recovery plan for Dominica. Resilience building has in fact become the buzzword for our small island developing states in the Caribbean, because we are all extremely vulnerable to climate-related disasters and exogenous shocks. We have actually chosen to approach resilience building from a holistic standpoint that takes into account the need to have climate resilient systems, prudent disaster risk management, and effective disaster risk response. What we have identified is that a critical component of achieving resiliency is the need to have strong communities and effective social structures. Social protection is key to efforts to ensure that the most vulnerable of our population can live a fulfilling life. This has to be supported with efforts at economic diversification and growth and employment creation. The impact of hazards can affect all persons within a population, but they affect the marginal and most vulnerable disproportionately, since their coping mechanisms and capacities to withstand shocks are usually less than other groups. So social protection includes policies and programs which assist individuals and families, especially poor and indigent and low-income single-parent households and the elderly, to cope with crisis and shocks. Recovery can often also exacerbate economic inequality. Whatever social ills or inequalities exist or are not well managed prior to disaster are often magnified after disaster. And as a result, urgent attention is required during the time of normalcy to build that resilience. Well-designed social protection systems will provide the much-needed cushion for the vulnerable. An important component of that is the need to have access to adequate healthcare, proper education, and decent housing. Within the Caribbean, for example, a number of social protection schemes already exist, but they need to be broadened to support the most vulnerable. And so Dominica's Climate Resilience Recovery Plan commits to 20 climate resilient targets, placing strong communities at the top of the pyramid, and so much emphasis is placed on individual, family, and community resilience. And a primary factor in assessing a community's level of resilience is determining the flexibility or robustness of its infrastructure, because it is these structures that play a critical role in protecting the residents from the elements of nature. So climate change will have a significant impact on expected future losses in the Caribbean basin. It will contribute an additional US $1.4 billion in additional annual losses by 2050. This only represents the losses associated with increased wind damage and excludes additional losses from storm surge and sea level rise, for example. So climate-related hazards such as hurricanes, flood, droughts, landslides, and seismic-related events are a part of the regional Caribbean landscape. Our goal must be safer, more resilient, and sustainable social and infrastructural development, which is core to achieving a resilient Caribbean community. A safer and more resilient society promotes sustained economic development and embodies 5 key components, which are social protection for the marginal and the most vulnerable, infrastructure hardening, economic diversification, environmental protection, and operational readiness. Strong communities are in fact the foundation of resilient societies and provide the infrastructure that will allow countries like Dominica and other small island developing states to adapt to the increasing challenges from climate change and other shocks, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you, and I hope to come in on other topics later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Francine. That was really, really great to hear. And so, Khaled, please can I ask you to unmute yourself and introduce yourself to our audience today?
Hello, do you hear me? Yes, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. It depends on your time location. Thank you to you and the panelists for this really imperative topic, and also thank you to the audience who are really participating with us. This topic is coming as a really imperative that we had a lot of work over this presidency, as I am from the G20 finance track, Saudi IWG co-lead. And as you can see, we started with that. Infrastructure is always important, as we all are experiencing it in every day and in every moment in our life. So in particular, this social infrastructure topic that we had. From my side, I would really be happy to cover the G20 presidency in their capacity this year by actually what covered by Fabron and also covered by Cecilia, that these social infrastructure are really imperative to the end user of the infrastructure, yet there is an aspect of the economic growth which they have really well covered, and not to forget the other aspects of the infrastructure when it comes for resilience, talking about climate change, talking about the well maintenance and well maintenance, building inclusive societies, delivering strong, sustainable, balanced growth behind this. As many governments have included infrastructure spending as part of their yearly spending, resilience is part of the policy when it comes for policy making, and how we make sure this is as a perpetual growth there. As they say that resilient infrastructure is actually an indicator for resilient societies. So that's why this topic is really important, and we had built up based on the principles and the guidance that we have inherited from prior work of the other presidencies and the Japanese in specific, talking about the principles that we built together, where there is main principles regarding the integrating of social consideration and infrastructure investment, so to be prior to each investment. So there will be no non-discriminatory manner for the society. Also, when it comes for labor, that they have equal opportunity to access to the jobs. So we look at it, infrastructure, not only from the delivery, from also the preparation, conceptualization, when it comes for preparing the infrastructure, building the infrastructure. So this will end up all the way to the chain where you have an infrastructure that is really resilient and also societal for the end user. Also, we strengthen based on what? Based on the governance. So this is also another element in our hand that we built up on that to have it there. Specifically this year, we have two priorities that we'll talk about them in the next segment that we had, or if you want me to I can elaborate on them now, or what do you think?
I think if you can hold them, and maybe we can bring them in a bit later in the discussion. So, was there anything you wanted to kind of finish on there, Khaled, before I hand over?
I'm just would like to say that Infrastructure has a lot of users, a lot of beneficiary behind it, and the role is how to balance all these requirements. But at the end of the day, when we reach the pandemic, that I wanted to conclude with, the pandemic has highlighted and made it a lot of issues floating, and this was also covered by a lot of members here, and actually it made the redefinition of the infrastructure that everybody who works in the street realize the importance of the infrastructure, which is really important. So happy to discuss further these issues. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Khaled. Hopefully we'll come back to that, so don't worry. So last but not least, Peter, perhaps you can give us an introduction to yourself and your thoughts on the link between social infrastructure and resilience.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Katie. I'm Peter Matthews. I'm the Executive Director and a board member of COST, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative. We currently work in 19 countries, working with government, the private sector and civil society to promote transparency and accountability in public and increasingly public-private investment in infrastructure. I'm also the Executive Director of Engineers Against Poverty, an independent NGO based here in London. And I have the honor this year of being the international lead of the C20 Infrastructure Working Group and part of the C20 Steering Committee. With regard to your question, Katie, like Khaled, I immediately thought about the coronavirus pandemic because I think it provides a really good case study that can help speak to why or how social infrastructure is key to building resilience. One of the things that it exposed is chronic underspend on social infrastructure over a sustained period, at least from 2008 and the financial crisis, and probably long before that. So, and I think it provides a really useful case study of how inadequate social infrastructure, in this case, public health systems, let us down when they are not sufficiently resilient. So, some countries have done better than others, but those that struggled, and I would put my own country, the UK, in this category, a lack of resilience manifested itself, for example, in hospital wards that became overwhelmed, lack of personal protective equipment, too few ventilators, and health systems being incapable of establishing track and trace systems. And when we look at the countries that performed best, not exclusively, but particularly in East Asia, I think, they tend to be those that have invested in infrastructure and have strong public institutions. Now, I'm not going to push that point too far because I know that there are also countries in which infrastructure is poor and governance weak. But despite that, they have coped very well in relative terms with the pandemic. So clearly there are other things that are going on too. But this doesn't invalidate the proposition that high levels of investment and capable public institutions are important elements of building resilience. So specifically, how does this case study help answer the question you put before us? I'm suggesting that if you invest in public health, which includes buildings and equipment that can be used flexibly, investing in people who are well-trained, adequately rewarded and highly motivated, and also importantly, institutions that can function under stress, you will be better equipped to manage public health crisis and your health infrastructure will be more resilient. Now, if it were that easy, we could probably end the session here and there would be no further problems, but it isn't. Public financial management is difficult. There are inevitably multiple demands on the public purse. Politics get involved, spending priorities become distorted by different political disputes. And too often there's a lack of accountability for the decisions that are made. I hope that there will eventually be public inquiries into how the coronavirus pandemic was managed, but I won't hold my breath. If they do happen, I hope that it will include an examination of the role of austerity and its impact on public health infrastructure, where in many countries, my own included, public health has really starved of funds over a very long period, at least over a decade. I'll pause there, Katie. I hope that at least begins to answer your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. So I think there's lots of like really interesting topics that have come up, and a few, I think, areas that I'd really like to push further on. But I think firstly for our audience and perhaps also for myself included, we talk about this term of social infrastructure, and from my perspective, I feel like I've heard it used in reference to a couple of different ways. So firstly, in a very specific sense, so social infrastructure is healthcare systems, it's public space, perhaps including educational facilities, for instance. But also this sense, and particularly when we're starting to talk about resilience, which is quite, in many respects, a holistic way of thinking about, the cities or the spaces that we live in. This idea of, or are we talking about social infrastructure as a whole new way of thinking about all infrastructure, because all infrastructure ultimately serves some sort of social purpose. So, Peter, if you're happy for me to come back to you, given you're the chair of the infrastructure working group for the C20, I just wondered if you could help me and maybe some of our audience members today out a little bit by perhaps either clarifying or further elaborating on, is there a working definition for social infrastructure, or am I onto something there by saying that perhaps it's kind of used in a couple of different ways, depending on the context or whoever we're talking to?
No, I think you're right, Katie. This is it's an open question, isn't it? This is not something that's settled. And I think another impact of the coronavirus pandemic, we are testing some of our thoughts around these ideas. So I think you're right that usually when we talk of social infrastructure, it's thought to apply to the provision of social services, such as healthcare, where it would be hospitals and clinics, education, where it's schools and universities, and public facilities, if it's community housing or it's prisons. And that would contrast with economic infrastructure, which tends to relate to infrastructure that's vital to the functioning of the economy. Energy, transportation, and financial institutions is usually included in that. So those are kind of the classic definitions, I think. Part of its weakness, I think, sometimes is that it can focus our minds on the kind of the physical assets. There's another way of disaggregating types of infrastructure. You don't hear it quite so often, but it's hard and soft infrastructure, with the hard infrastructure being the physical assets and the soft infrastructure being the policies, systems, and procedures that surround the physical assets and are used in their application. So I think the important thing here is that when we're talking about infrastructure, and in fact it applies to social and economic, there are tangible aspects to it. There are kind of constructed, built assets, but there are also intangible things as well. And obviously that would include things like policies and systems and procedures. But I think it potentially goes further than that. I think it can be related to culture and social norms. And it includes the users of infrastructure and how they see and relate to infrastructure. So I think in its broadest sense, that's what a definition takes us towards. I think it's also important to point out that people and economies depend both on social and economic infrastructure. So it's not that the banks want the economic infrastructure and the people want the social infrastructure. Both matter, and functioning societies, vibrant economies require both. But I think there are certain characteristics of social infrastructure that it's worth thinking about and are useful when you're thinking about economic growth and human development. And particularly also in relation to resilience. I think people tend to identify with and care about social infrastructure, for example, your local school or hospital, in a way that's less common with financial infrastructure, a national highway or an energy grid, for example. People usually live in close physical proximity to social infrastructure, and they'll relate to them as community assets. So you and your neighbors will discuss your local surgery, the hospital, the clinic, how the school is doing, how they're looking after the children if it's financed properly. So people relate to social infrastructure slightly differently. There will be some exceptions to that, I think, but they take an interest in it. And importantly, they're willing to get involved in protecting it and improving it. I'll just, by way of concluding, just make a reference to the cost program that I introduced initially. That's about disclosing information, informing and empowering citizens, stakeholders, so that they can hold decision makers to account. And where accountability is strengthened, decision making tends to become improved, corruption, mismanagement, and inefficiency are reduced. You get better value for money, and ultimately you get a better quality of infrastructure and services. So transparency, accountability, informed and active citizens, I would argue, is an important part of improving the resilience. And I think there are particular opportunities around social infrastructure to do that. We've got examples in Uganda where public meetings, or what they call baraza, are used to introduce people, explain and discuss the data that's being disclosed by government. And they've now reached a stage where they're inviting public officials to come to those meetings. And on a number of occasions where communities and individuals have had maybe some fear or resentment about an intervention to build a new rural road close to their community, when you can create a dialogue around informed consent, people having access to data, they're more likely to understand and support the investment, but more importantly, take a stake in it. And there are examples in Uganda where there was mistrust of government based on previous experience, where there was very poor consultation. But through this interaction, through sharing data, through informing and empowering stakeholders, now it's much more a partnership. And we find not only does that benefit citizens, because they're able to influence the design and the process of delivering the infrastructure, but it helps the government too. There are examples where local people had knowledge about flood patterns, and that wasn't necessarily built into the design. So where you can create that dialogue where people become informed and empowered, I think that can add to resilience, which I think a point a couple of my co-panelists were making in their opening remarks. So I'll pause there, Katie. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So I just wondered if any of the other panelists would like to add comment or perhaps challenge some of what Peter may have just said. Just looking for any hands. Cecilia, go for it.
Yeah, no, thank you, Peter. I think this was really interesting, actually, also opening up. So we're not only talking about the physical infrastructure, but also actually talking about the soft parts of that, for example, policy. And from UN Habitat's perspective, when we talk about public space or social infrastructure, we often talk about everything that is public or that is open to the community or is open to public use. So it's the streets, it's the open spaces, it's the public facilities. But I think it's also really important that we need to take that integrated and holistic approach on a citywide level, because we've been doing assessments in many cities in the south of public space as an asset, and looking at the quantity and the quality. And you'll find that public space is not equitably distributed across the city. Especially in poor communities, you'll find that a lot of public space and social infrastructure is sometimes non-existent. So I think that's one of the areas where public policy is really important, is that we need to ensure that integrated, holistic, citywide approach, equitable distribution, ensuring that they're inclusive, so there's no cost to the use of those spaces. And I think that's really important, because many local governments often try and put a cost to the use of some spaces to be able to manage them. They say that they need to have an income to be able to manage those spaces. But I think that's the important thing, is that there should not be a cost to the use of those spaces. They need to be people-oriented. And we're also finding that a lot of spaces, we need to think about them from a multifunctional use. So, a street can also double up as a street market. So you have that livelihood aspect at different times of the day. It also becomes a play space in informal settlements, for example, for children to play. It becomes a space for women to socialize while they're doing the washing. There's so many different aspects to these spaces, and I think we need to look at that as well. And that's why public policy is also really important, is to take into consideration that multifunctional use of those spaces. And that's why it's so important to understand the needs of the community. So being able to have that dialogue with communities of what their needs are and to be able to support those needs. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Cecilia. That's great. And I really liked the example that you gave there of the street. Just that one example highlighted that if you only thought of the street as in the definition of economic infrastructure, you think about it as one thing. If you only thought about it in terms of the social infrastructure, it's perhaps something different. But actually, when you think about what can a street offer, what are its different multi kind of functional facets, and perhaps thinking about it through a resilience lens, for instance, then those traditional definitions of economic infrastructure, social infrastructure, are actually perhaps in some respects like nonsensical. So I think that was a really, really nice example to give, actually, to kind of illustrate the challenge sometimes with the definitions that we've come up with. Donna, I wondered if you, because I just noted here that in your introduction you said we need to repurpose our view of social infrastructure. So I thought there might be some more behind that you'd like to share with us.
Thank you. Yes, good that you caught that phrase. In the Red Cross, we want to push boundaries all the time. We see how communities are suffering because of the changing climate, and we need to find new ways, innovative ways to actually deliver services to communities. So just to add on the really interesting discussion, so if we use social infrastructure to strengthen resilience, we also might want to define what we mean by resilience. So in the Red Crescent family, for us, resilience is about preparing communities, empowering them, giving them the type of skills and knowledge that will allow them to actually face the risks of tomorrow, but already build their capacities today. That will enable them to actually anticipate and be able to really bounce forward immediately after a disaster. So using that definition and putting it in the context of social infrastructure, for us, we feel that social infrastructure should be empowering. Several people already said this, and then for this to be realized, communities need to be part of the planning process. Communities need to contribute and be part of the decision making in determining what to put where, what program to develop, and things that, and develop programs and interventions that will actually help them strengthen new capacities or old ones. And it also needs to be inclusive, of course. Cecilia and Peter also touched on this. Inclusivity is key in planning, and that reinforces the connectivity, but also gives them voice in the whole essence of things. Because at the end of the day, there will be the ones who will be affected by risk. There'll be the ones who will be affected by changes. So might as well, they need to be part of the discourse. One social infrastructure, with the loose definition of what goes under, or the umbrella of definition of social infrastructure, I was just thinking, debating with myself, early warning system is a system on the ground that is not normally categorized under the traditional notion of social infrastructure, economic infrastructure. But at the end of the day, it provides public service. It gives the people warnings in advance to actually move ahead before the disaster, the risks come. And so using early warning, early action as part of the soft infrastructure in early warning system, this is really empowering. This is really helping communities have a say. One example I will just touch on is in the Red Cross, we use, we call it forecast-based financing. It's an approach towards early warning system that when we argue that we have to be able to allow the communities to understand that the forecast, seasonal climate forecast, what have you, and be able to act early on, and that empowers them, and that repurposes the use of traditional early warning systems. Forecast-based financing also ensures the link with policies. As mentioned earlier, the soft infrastructure, I totally agree. Without the right policy, you can never initiate programs that would address the different types of risks that we face now. The enabling environment needs to be changed first and foremost. Otherwise, you cannot even pilot test. You can even develop new things that are responsive. I remember when we were rehabilitating after Haiyan and in the recovery program, one of the key challenges that we had was so we had the risk assessment. Where we need to rebuild the schools. That was the key in the local community. But then local community wanted to just rebuild the school in the same area that was hit by the storm surge, using the exact same materials. So this is not about resilient infrastructure, building resilient communities. If we need to really underscore and add the science, the risk assessment, and communities in the planning, so we don't repeat, we don't miss out, we don't end up wasting resources in developing the physical and the soft infrastructure. So I think it's really a combination of a lot of things, and repurposing will help us push boundaries and really see things in a different way, with the end in view of really helping communities on the ground. Sorry, it took long.
No, that was great. Thank you, Donna. And yeah, I think, personal perspective here is kind of taking that more holistic view, whilst often challenging, and you're obviously moving away perhaps from existing status quo kind of ways of doing things. Ultimately we are increasingly understanding how interconnected everything is, and we are becoming more sophisticated in the way that we understand how different systems interact with one another. I think something we'll hopefully touch on a bit later is us quite excited to see the launch of the Infratech part of the G20 infrastructure agenda this year, which I think starts to allude to that idea that actually we can have that information to our, at our fingertips to better understand actually how infrastructure does interact with people and society and the planet and context it exists with. But what I wanted to ask actually Francine, because I was sort of interested in when you gave your introduction that you were kind of talking about, your focus in Dominica is kind of on is really on embracing and pushing forward with resilience. And you mentioned putting strong communities at the top of the pyramid, of priorities. And I thought it was quite interesting because I would assume maybe some others might think that strong economy would be at the top of the pyramid. And I'm wondering if, is there actually a conflict between those two things, or in sort of following on from Donna's train of thought, in kind of repurposing how we understand, how we build resilience, what that means for social infrastructure, is focusing on strong communities hand in hand with thinking about developing strong economies.
Thanks, Katie, and definitely they do go hand in hand. But if you have a strong economy and your communities are weak, then you're still going to have a difficulty. What we experienced with Hurricane Maria was a complete loss of services, and when the hurricane struck Dominica, there were some communities that were actually cut off, and they were cut off from services to the wider island for a period of time. So our communities need to be able to have the capacity to absorb stress and be able to bounce back very quickly. And so there has to be within the community the ability to continue to access basic services, to have proper shelter, to have access to food, water, telecoms, and so on. And so key to addressing the question of resilience is how do we make these communities able to continue to exist in a normal manner, even after a disaster? And that requires you to look at the different aspects of resiliency at a community level. So we had a situation, for example, where schools were used as shelters. And so for many months, children were not able to go back to school because persons continued to occupy the schools because their homes were destroyed. So how do you make your community more resilient? You have to look at purpose-built shelters for persons in the event of a disaster. And you also have to help people to rebuild their homes to become resilient so that they don't have to leave their home or their home is not destroyed in the event of an extreme weather event. But tied to this as well is the question of having a robust economy. The economy needs to be strong, it needs to be diversified so that the elements of building a strong community can be put in place. We have, for example, the impact of COVID-19 on our economies, particularly in the Caribbean, which is maybe the most heavily dependent tourism region of the world. And of course, we know how tourism has seriously been impacted by COVID-19. So you're looking at a situation where in many instances, 50 to 70% of a country's income is reliant on tourism. And when tourism comes to a complete halt, that affects your ability to provide the social services that are required for your population. So the need to build a robust economy that is diversified, that allows other parts to function, notwithstanding the shock of one part, for example, tourism, is critical. And it's critical to diversify and be able to transfer the risk and for a country to be able to continue to provide education, healthcare, and other services to its population. And I think all of these elements are integrated. How do you become resilient if your citizens are not properly educated, do not have access to healthcare, do not have access to employment opportunities? Then your ability to develop a resilient society is going to be affected. So all of these things are interconnected. The challenge is for small states, which is different for more developed countries, is that you have to prioritize what you spend the limited resources that you have on. So whereas you would want to put in place structures that can, physical infrastructure that at the hospitals, the schools, proper roads, proper bridges, and so on. You also have to just juxtapose that to the need to provide the social infrastructure that is social support to persons who are unable to afford. And your ability to do that is affected by your lack of resources. So all of these things are interconnected, and it's something that we continue to aspire to. We have developed a climate resilience recovery plan that targets us to become resilient by 2030, and that looks at different result areas: strong communities, a robust economy, well-planned and durable infrastructure, enhanced collective consciousness, and strengthen institutional systems. We spoke about the soft part of infrastructure. So we need to look at developing policies and strategies that are geared towards building that resilience that our communities need. We need to ensure that our decisions that we take are data-driven, and that we maximize on the limited resources we have. So thank you.
Thank you, Francine. So just want to do a quick reminder to anyone listening in that you can ask questions as well by posting them on the chat box. I think Winnie, our tech moderator, has sent a reminder out there. So please do send us your questions as well. But just following up from Francine's point there around, that there is a link between focusing on strong communities and having strong economies and vice versa, and your ability to be resilient. So I'm sort of interested in how well aligned, and maybe this is potentially a slightly controversial question to ask, I don't know, how well aligned is the current G20 agenda with what sounds to be perhaps a new way of thinking about how do we make infrastructure investments, and how do we understand, or how do we build resilient communities through thinking about some of the more societal, the physical as well as the soft aspects of infrastructure. And I know, so Khaled, in your introduction, you mentioned that, in terms of policy making, seeing that resilient infrastructure is an indicator of resilient societies, which sounds like it is embedded, and that actually COVID has created an increased focus or increased understanding of the link between resiliency in communities, resiliency in infrastructure, and our ability to cope with global pandemics. But then, Henry, in your intro, you kind of mentioned that perhaps there's a challenge about creating the right type of project. So I'm going to do what every facilitator shouldn't do and leave it open to the two of you maybe to kind of fight out how to comment on that. But yeah, Henry or Khaled, I'm just sort of wondering if you, as at first stance, is this where the G20 is headed, or is what we're talking about and what Donna and Cecilia and Peter and Francine have sort of presented, is that quite different to how the G20 currently thinks about infrastructure? Henry, Khaled, go for it.
That's right. Thank you for the question. It is actually, as I said, in G20, they build on the principles, that is the quality infrastructure investment principles, that are 6 principles, and they build up the work based on these principles, that we have them endorsed last year during the Japanese presidency, where there is a pillar, as I said, it says in a principle among those 6. It's talking specifically about the resilience by saying integrating a social infrastructure, by saying integrating the infrastructure consideration and infrastructure investment in a way that it touches a lot of the points that the panelists have mentioned when it comes for the soft infrastructure, that I like the better definition than that, in order to lead to the physical infrastructure that he's explaining. And in order for, judging in the deciding if the current G20 is providing that aspect or not, allow me, if I can, just provide what G20 specifically in this year has provided in terms of their priorities and deliverables. So we make sure that we understand the social infrastructure as well as, and from the lenses from the lenses of resiliency, and also to understand what the G20 has done in this side to actually try to bridge the understanding among them. And under the Saudi presidency, as I said, we build up based on these principles, and we had actually started by saying that there was a study done by Infrastructure Global Hub regarding the current limited resources that the public domain has. So currently there is a shortage in the resources, and the study is showing that there is almost there is a gap in the conservative way of 15 trillion by 2040, which means that countries cannot really afford that kind of funding for the infrastructure projects. in general, not necessarily social or not, but this is as a public domain. So as a presidency, we look to this as a basis, and this is why, by the way, the most conservative analysis. There are other analysis that is much, much higher than this, and this is going to the point that Francis has mentioned, that currently there are limited resources. So with these limited resources, we thought about structuring two priorities, actually. One is the main one, which is the infrastructure technologies, where you can say that infrastructure technologies can put smart ways in order to utilize these limited resources, have them optimized, not necessarily to follow the old and legacy way of allocation, as well as looking to the principles themselves, where they have brought also governance around these. So the infrastructure technology agenda actually aims to promote technology and infrastructure to improve investment delivery, decisions on the infrastructure, overall the whole life cycle, from the social, economical, and environmental outcomes. And so these are the three triangles that we try to balance between them in order to ensure that these infrastructure technologies. And we have focused on the support from the countries as they can play a role by providing examples and how they outlays and for enhancing service delivery, also to how to tunnel the mobilization of the private sector investment in a specific way, and achieving also the environmental, as I said, the environmental and social benefits. So the infrastructure basically was supported also with a list of examples with the help of the infrastructure of the Global Infrastructure Hub, to provide, and we have worked with them to provide examples how these sometimes smart technologies can provide really addition to the social infrastructure. Then the pandemic came on the way, and we found that the infrastructure technology has really redefined the understanding of the infrastructure. For example, now I'm having this virtual meeting in my personal space from my home, and it becomes like a house, or like an office. Also, this home is a school, mini class for as a school for my children. So these are the definitions that technologies has added to this. Now is that how we have focused is on the affordable technologies that can really add value. For example, that there are small chips that could be inserted in the water system that can really being so smart in order to deliver the water or decide which water with the limited resources of the water to which village based on the utilization time for these villages. And also there are other technologies that is the space is limited to this. So these are types of technologies that, to be honest, that we try to focus on that to affordable. Yet the agenda also covers if the other countries would like or policy setters would like to use the highly advanced technologies. So this is when it comes to the infratech agenda. Yet we have discussed in the infratech agenda the challenge between how to enhance economic, social, and environmental for value balancing between all of them. The other priority that we have worked on this year is the private sector collaboration. What we have done, we have worked with more than 100 of private sector, and we asked them actually on their views and how to bridge the gap of the financing gap that I talked about at the beginning. Private sector, there was a specific section in that report, and it's already published and endorsed by, welcomed by the finance ministers and central bank governors, has a specific section related to the environmental, social, and governance aspects. And what I like is that those top, we talked about top investors who are really having investments in a lot of geographical places. They for example, if I want to quote one of them that we had more than 100 engagements for more than 100 private sector. One of them said, this is nice, not nice to have. Now it's a must to have, because many of the countries, MDBs, the IOs now, actually won't allow for countries to utilize their resources unless they follow the ESG's which is the environmental, social, and governance criteria. So it is, I can say it's a progressing, but it is maybe at a slower pace. But I think the corona made an alerting for everybody that it's the time for it. Sorry, I'll take so long, but I just wanted to make sure that you understand that that this is the work that G20 is currently is actually pursuing under the Saudi presidency, and I'll leave it to.
Thank you. And don't worry at all. There was a lot you had to cover there. So it's good to hear, about that focus on not just economic but social and environmental, and that perceptions are changing. Particularly, you mentioned the private sector example there of this is becoming a must-have rather than a nice-to-have. But I'm kind of interested to ask Henry maybe to comment as well, because you mentioned in your introduction, as I said, part of the challenge is finding the right types of projects. But you also talked about the G20 aim to establish infrastructure as an asset class. And, I think there might be some out there that kind of think, particularly as Khaled's mentioned, there was a huge kind of conversation that happened with bringing the private sector in, but perhaps there might be concerns around privatization of public infrastructure or social infrastructure. I think a couple of our other panelists have kind of talked to the importance of involving communities in the conversations around, what infrastructure could look like, should look like, and whether they have been involved in the process so far. And so I'm interested in your views on, the G20 agenda and how well it has embraced this idea of social infrastructure, or not, perhaps, to date.
Yeah, thank you. And Khaled already covered a lot of the, the priorities of G20. I guess obviously this year has been, the G20 action plan has been focused on sort of addressing the COVID situation. So it's sort of like changed a little bit to those priorities. I think it's fair to say when it comes to resilience, that resilience was always along sustainability and inclusivity. I guess a focus, but it's fair to say that before it was more like, unfortunately sometimes still is, the resilience of the infrastructure itself. And so essentially when you start looking at it this way, you end up, I'm taking every single infrastructure I have and I'm trying to sort of make it resilient, which obviously come up with a huge price tag. And then, you do the studies and then after that you decide nothing. And I think that's a real challenge for the governments overall, and even more so now with COVID, is the multiplicity of priorities. So right now, if you're a government, you have to create jobs, you have to make your infrastructure resilient, you have to basically solve the pandemic, all that with decreasing tax revenues and an economic crisis looming. And so I think that's where looking at it, and a lot of the other panelists have covered it from the community perspective, and actually looking at the infrastructure that make the communities resilient. That's probably the one. I'm not sure whether we want to call that one social or critical infrastructure, but that's really the one that actually matters. And that's one where the government wants to focus on. And the only way to really do this, unfortunately, when it comes to resilience, is it's not unlike sustainability. Sustainability, you can add CO2 savings across multiple assets, and they can add up, right? When it comes to resilience, you really have to embrace the complexity. You have to embrace the system. And the only way to really understand it is actually work with the community. So I think even, among the governments, they start sort of more and more clear understanding that resilience actually requires that level of community engagement and that prioritization process that will really enable them to highlight, okay, this is the priority. I don't have so much money that I can actually make all my bridges resistant to basically to every risk. I actually have to prioritize. So I think that is probably a change that we've seen, is that recognition and that sort of search for actually frameworks that will actually allow them to prioritize on the right type of investment. So that's kind of like the first step, which is identifying the key critical infrastructure, or infrastructure that actually will make your communities more resilient. The second part is, how do we actually pay for it? And really, the infrastructure as an asset class roadmap that was devised by G20 is it's not a thesis that basically said that private investment is good all the time. It's really around sort of general principles that are around improving the project development, some form of standardization to allow basically investors to potentially come in more easily. And when you look at it, I mean, standardization and sort of improving project development is a huge cost, whether you actually use a private sector or public investment. Like the IMF did a study recently where they basically, they say on average, country loses, I think, up to 30% of the value of their public investment through inefficiencies. So I think that's really kind of the focus, is actually trying to standardize and improve the way infrastructure is being delivered. And then comes the question, can a private investor actually provide better value than what we could do through public investment? So again, I don't think there's always the answer as yes, the private sector can do better. In some cases, it actually doesn't. It doesn't make sense. And I think when you look at social infrastructure, that's usually because it's kind of directly paid by the government. So you're talking about availability payments. You're also usually talking about small size type of transactions. And usually when you have those two together, it becomes a bit harder. The private sector, the cost of transaction is pretty high. The cost of preparing all those different scenarios can be pretty high. So if the asset is too small, that's where you have an issue. But what we're saying is that there's ways to basically address that by sort of bundling assets together, which is one way it's been done. Sometimes privatization of other assets as a way to pay for new social infrastructure. So you actually privatize assets that actually private sector makes sense, and you actually use that money to basically sponsor social infrastructure that actually would not benefit from private investment. So I think there's a lot of complexity there, but I don't think it's fair to say the G20 priority is not necessarily to transform all assets into private investment necessary.
Thank you. And I want to bring Peter in because I know he wanted to comment on this, but I'm just interested when you said there, often the challenge or the hurdle to overcome is when the assets are too small, so you can aggregate them into groups. And in practice, how easy is that to do?
Not so easy, but it can be done. So France did that for a few of their...
Sorry, Terry, how would someone go about doing that if, someone's listening in thinking that's, how do I actually do that in practice?
Great question. So, our role as the hub is actually share those practices. So there's actually, if you reach out to us or actually look at our website, there's a couple of examples of how that can be done. There's various countries. France did that for several of the sort of civic buildings. We have examples in Africa where across countries actually can be done with the help of multilaterals in order to basically break that transaction size to something that's more feasible, I guess, for the private sector to come in. So I think bundling things together actually works quite well. And to use, I can't remember who said that, but pushing the boundaries actually. What I've realized in my previous experience working at the Resilient Cities Network, previously so-called under RC at some point, was actually by bundling and making projects sometimes a bit more complex, they were actually getting better. So there's those examples in Rotterdam that we managed to move to Surat in India around the sort of water plaza. And essentially those water plaza were both resilient, essentially places for rainwater excess to actually flow in, but that happens once every 2 years. So during that time, actually, that plaza was a playground. And frankly, if you try to fund those two things separately, you wouldn't have the space, and to find the financing, the funding will actually be quite difficult. By putting them together, but actually making the project more complex, making it like a hybrid between the water and the social infrastructure, you actually sort of made it possible. And I think for resilience, that's something that we found quite often, is that resilience alone can be a difficult sell. especially if you're talking about an event that may happen in sort of 10 to 20 years, and actually sort of bundling it either across multiple assets or with other type of projects actually make the investment more, better value, I guess, and more accessible to private sector.
Thank you. Really interesting. So top tip for listeners, I think, was to head to the Global Infrastructure Hub. Was it for more examples and case studies on things like that? Was that?
Yeah, that was my call for action as well. This is actually something that we're going to continue to work. We've started with the Saudi presidency, and we will continue with the Italian presidency, is to actually aggregate those best practices. We don't claim to know, to actually tell you which is the best practices, but I think we believe there's enormous value in sharing those ideas and those examples for other countries or places to be like, well, actually that could work. That could work in my place.
Interesting, and really kind of embraces that idea that you said about you've got to embrace the complexity in order to make it work, essentially, by bringing things together that perhaps you ordinarily wouldn't think of as going together. So Peter, sorry, I'm just noticing the time as well. You said you wanted to kind of come in on the G20 agenda question.
Yes, thanks, Katie. I'll be brief because I know time is tight. I just wanted to endorse what Henry said, actually, about the Global Infrastructure Hub website. They produce some fantastic data, and they're a good kind of repository for tools and resources. So Henry is right in what he's saying, and I encourage people to go and look at the resources. Yeah, just on the G20 approach, part of my job as the C20 lead on infrastructure is to provide a critique. And whilst there's lots of areas of agreement, I think, between the C20 and G20 around infrastructure, this is one that separates us. And I think there is a feeling from the C20 that there is an overemphasis. And I accept what both Khalid and Henry have said. They are sophisticated people, and it's not one or the other. It's not state bad and private sector good. So I don't want to caricature it, but it is at least an emphasis, I think. And in many parts of the world, particularly low-income countries, private and institutional investment makes up a really tiny fraction of current investment. It's governments that tend to invest. In Africa, I think I'm right in saying it's in most countries, it's probably less than 1% of private and institutional investment. So it just seems a huge risk, a kind of a leap in the dark, that if we're going to fill this backlog of, you sometimes hear it's a financing gap. I rather think it's an infrastructure services gap. I think that works a bit better. But if you're going to fill this gap, if you're going to do it largely through increasing private and institutional investment, you're taking a tiny fraction of investment, and you have to somehow increase that by an enormous figure. But if you can get improvements in public sector investment, and Henry mentioned himself that the IMF, and it concurs with cost experience, on average about 1/3 of investment is lost through corruption, mismanagement, and inefficiency. And in low-income countries, that would be much higher. So in theory, you never get rid of inefficiency altogether, but you could get up to 1/3 additional productive investment without having to mobilize additional finance if you can secure those efficiencies. Plus, the IMF just a week ago came out and really encouraged governments. Now is the time to borrow to invest in infrastructure. It has been for a number of years, actually. But historically low interest rates, government can borrow at almost no cost whatsoever. And if you've got well-planned projects, then those investments create a return to the government that more than offsets any cost of borrowing. There are particular challenges, again, in low-income countries who don't have access to finance in the same way. So they require a different approach. So, there's a very different view on this. And I think, last word, if anyone wants to read a very thorough critique of this, our friends at Eurodebt did a publication. I think it's called 3 Reasons Why the G20's push to establish infrastructure as an asset class is fundamentally flawed. It's a very long title, but a very good read. I do recommend it.
And if you could give us the kind of top 3 points out of that report that maybe sit in the executive summary, what would they be, Peter?
Oh, you're really going to test my memory. It came out in 2018. One of the points is that I made, it's a leap in the dark. I mean, it's a huge risk. And there are global crises that we face, not just the coronavirus pandemic, but the climate crisis, species extinction, lack of progress on the sustainable development goals. We really need solutions that can work, and it's just too risky to think that private and institutional investment can close that gap. It leaves out low-income countries. Forgive me, Katie, it's much richer than that, but the time available and my weak memory at my age is not helping me.
That's okay. So just going to squeeze in a cheeky question from the audience here before we kind of move to close. So Charlotte's interested to know what's the role of technology in advancing accountability and participation. So I know a number of you have touched on, what are the right types of projects or well-planned projects. We've kind of talked a little bit about, community involvement in projects, and I'm making a bit of an assumption here that perhaps inherent in that idea of right types of projects and well-planned projects is actually making sure there is community and societal representation in the briefing and scoping of what those projects might be. And I guess kind of building on the reference earlier to the infratech kind of focus that maybe is coming through, is there a way that actually technology can help us in this regard? Does anyone want to make a very brief kind of response or comment on that? Khaled? Go for it. Make it brief.
Yeah, sure. It's actually infrastructure, in short, has a lot of merits attached to it. One of which is that the data that Peter talked about and emphasized about. So data is actually, once you have the data and the data collection system becomes very, rich when it comes, you embed the technologies because of the repository that you can build, the outcomes that you can build. One of them is that the transparency and the accountability of utilizing it. Infrastructure is more than just only structured building. If there is technologies attached to it, it would be able also to utilize to identify the users, number of users, identities, trace the materials, like one of the projects that we had in the examples. I think with the help of, my memory doesn't fail me, with the help of GIH, we had an example where they tag the material from the destination it shipped, all the project destination to was received, so the material can be traced. So these types of technology has a lot of merits attached to it. One of them is that the data that you can really collect and traceability and that will create an expert and smart system at down in the road of it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Khaled. And I'm sure there's a whole other interesting discussion there around data privacy and people's concerns on that as well. But anyway, unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time together. I feel like there's many things that we could have discussed which we didn't quite get the time to do so. But thank you very much to all of our panelists. I'd just like to give you one last chance to kind of get a message across. So if the G20 officials, ministers, and those in power who have joined us today walk away with one key message from this discussion, what would you like it to be? And I'm going to go in the same order that I did earlier. So Cecilia, and perhaps I'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Katie. I think the key message is that we often undervalue our public spaces and social infrastructure. I think a lot of that came out now. There's lack of resources, lack of frameworks, weak political will, absence of community engagement. So I think, we need to actually invest in actually building the capacity, being able to create those frameworks to be able to engage communities, but also to provide those frameworks to be able to manage and maintain those spaces. We need to create those spaces. We need to protect as well, which requires then enabling frameworks and laws and regulations to do that. So that would be my key message, is that we really need to support local and national governments in actually developing those frameworks to be able to do that.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Henry, how about you?
So I mean, the role of the GIH is to actually work on recommendations to the G20. So I guess I'll take the recommendation from everyone and try to basically address them. But I think, I mean, just to reflect a bit on what Peter was saying, that's exactly how we see it. I think that's where the focus next year is going to be on transformative infrastructure, and I guess the frameworks that will actually help governments to prioritize projects, and if that can be financed by private sector, that's great. But I think that decision-making process is absolutely critical, especially when it comes to social infrastructure and resilience. So I think the message is, there's a way to do it, and I guess, embrace those frameworks, look at what's been done elsewhere, learn from it, and as a result, the decision making is going to be there. Your investments will actually create more value, and communities will become more resilient.
Okay, thank you, Henry. Donna, what's your message?
Yes, still on the repurposing issue of our social infrastructure, I think that we need to intentionally use social infrastructure as vehicles to reach the last mile first. We need to focus the end point first, communities, what they need, and use this as the starting point in planning and developing social infrastructure. Let us use science, policy, and practice when we develop social infrastructures. Hard and soft interventions are needed, and we need to make sure that these also contribute to in scaling up climate action. Last but not least, let us go beyond resilience. Let us make social infrastructures as interventions that will allow communities and individuals to thrive and transform. At the end of the day, COVID showed us that what will happen tomorrow will be a surprise. Let's not be surprised. Let's make things strategic and purposely for the communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. So a bit of start with the end in mind, but we don't always know what the end might be, because we have to be prepared for anything. So thank you for that. Yeah. Francine, what's your message for those listening in today?
Thank you. And thank you for allowing me to be part of this. I think policies need to take into consideration the realities of small states. And if the solution that's being put forward is for the infrastructure gap to be filled by private investment, that in and of itself will not work for our small states. Peter made the point, and I think he's very correct in that. And for us, private investors usually want governments to guarantee their investments because of the inherent risks involved, and this affects the government debt level. So there is need to support governments in being able to access finance to invest in building resilience. And I think that has to be given priority. And we have to place small states in a different category from others, because we have particular vulnerabilities that other countries do not have. And so the solutions for us have to be different. Thank you.
Thank you, Francine. Khaled, you got something short and sweet for people to take away from today's discussion?
Yeah, thank you for this. It's actually, it reminds me of the Arabic saying that the one's hand that cannot clap by its own. So it's actually this type of engagement and having all the 30-60, discussion. So concerted efforts must be made, work intensified, and tasks should be divided, in my opinion. More importantly, sub-activities and matters should be identified, then should be placed in a priority order and dealt with according to the importance, and based on not even possibility, but on the affected results in order to achieve the ultimate goal. And that's exactly what we, to be honest, tried to do with the Infratech technology agenda, is that to be adopted in the future in order then to also to work in another pillar until we reach our goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Khaled. And then finally, Peter.
Yes, thanks, Katie. Khaled made mention previously to quality infrastructure investment, QII principles that have been adopted by the G20. They're actually quite good. They're not perfect, but I think they're quite good. They include principles around resilience. So my message to the G20 would be, please do more to adopt those principles yourselves, G20 countries, should be translating their words into action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you all to our fantastic panelists. I hope you'll all join me at home in a quick round of applause for all of them. It's been an absolute pleasure to spend the last 90 minutes with you all. Really would have loved to have talked for longer, because I think there was a lot to discuss, a lot of detail to get into that we didn't quite manage to get to today. But I hope that everyone listening has, has enjoyed the rest of the summit this week. Will enjoy the kind of closing hours. I think we're working towards the end of the summit today. And yeah, stay safe, everybody. And, let's look forward to social infrastructure as resilient infrastructure in the future. So I think all that remains is for us to wave goodbye. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.